Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Becoming Anchored podcast. My name is Laura Deneen. I am your host today, and we are joined by the lovely Dr. Laurie Cooper. Dr. Cooper, Laurie, is a colleague and former mentor, teacher, supervisor, friend, all the things. And so, well, she's a current friend, but a former supervisor. And I'm just super grateful for her today. It's really such a gift to have her on the show. And I'm super excited to dive into this content. So today we are going to be talking a little bit more about the intersection of eating disorders and trauma. But before we get into all of the amazing content that we have for you all, like I said, my name is Laura, and if you're new to this podcast, welcome. We are so glad that you found us, and we're just super thankful to have you on this ride with us. Lauren Jackson, my co-host, is not with us today, but she is with us in spirit. So let's just go ahead and get started. So the purpose of this podcast is really twofold. When Lauren and I were dreaming up what we wanted this podcast to be, we really wanted it to feel conversational and relational in nature. And so first and foremost, we are human with you all, and we will be sharing about our lived experiences, both, as friends, moms, wives, just doing life with you all. And so that's the first purpose of the podcast. And then the second purpose is really just to share some of our therapeutic wisdom that we have gleaned over the years. And I know Laurie feels this way as well, but sitting with clients is really just such a gift. And we both love this work. And so the cool part about this job and this podcast is really just the ability to share some of our experiences, both as humans and as clinicians. So thanks for being here. If you're with us, just a quick disclaimer. This is not therapy. And so if you are local to Tennessee, please reach out to either Laurie or us over at Anchored Counseling, and Laurie's website will be in the show notes if you are wanting to learn more about her and her practice. So if you are local to us, we would love to hear from you. And if not, please reach out for support to someone local in your area. So let's go ahead and dive in. Welcome, Laurie.
Thank you so much, Laura. It is a gift to be invited, and thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here.
Same. Well, like I said, I feel like Laurie has been so fundamental, and I was actually sharing this with her over breakfast a couple weeks ago, but just so fundamental in terms of how I practice, how I supervise and train my team to practice. And so I cannot say enough wonderful, amazing things about Laurie, and she is just such a gift to the Nashville community. And I know that you have had such a ripple effect over the years around all these clinicians that have learned from you and grown under you. And so we'll forever be grateful for you and your wisdom. Laurie and I were trying to decide on a topic, and this, I know that we could both talk about a lot of different things, but this felt pertinent. And I know that this is something that Laurie is really passionate about. So before we dive in, Laurie, are you open to sharing a little bit more about yourself and maybe a little bit more with our listeners about the work that you do?
Sure, yeah. So I'm a psychologist in private practice and have spent many, many years working with eating disorders. Sort of got into the work sort of accidentally, but really it keeps drawing me back over and over and over again. And so I'm a certified eating disorder specialist and consultant, and really love splitting my time between direct clinical care and supervision and that sort of thing. I've led teams before and worked in administration. I'm just really, the human spirit is never more present than when I'm working with somebody who has an eating disorder and is fighting back for their freedom and recovery. And so, it's something that really energizes me. I love it. I love doing supervision. I love really being able to share in that growth and awareness that newer clinicians, or even seasoned clinicians, I still do some supervision with other clinicians who are who are very, very well qualified, but just sharing that space because it can be a challenging space clinically to work with folks who are really, really in the midst of their struggles, or even the beginning of their struggles, or wherever they are. So so that's a bit about me, and I think if you ever want to get in touch with me, please don't hesitate to do that. I'm more than happy to entertain a phone call and do a quick consult or something like that.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, let's
Mm-hmm.
just go ahead and dive right in. I mean, I know that this is a big topic, right? Like we could spend many episodes talking about, not just trauma, but just trauma or just eating disorders, right? And really that's important to take note of, right? We're really just going to be scratching the surface, if you will, on this topic today because it is so big, and that is not lost on either myself or Laurie today. So we just really want to throw that out there, right? That it is a big topic and we acknowledge that. And I think that it is really important to talk through how these two pieces really intersect. So let's just go ahead and dive right in. Laurie, what are your thoughts on how eating disorders intersect in the realm of trauma?
Right. Well, I think to understand that, part of what we have to sort of understand is the function of eating disorders in general. So, eating disorders become a way that folks have learned to manage emotions that feel unmanageable, or regulate their emotions, right? And those emotions can come from a lot of different places. In part, I don't want to get too far afield, but in part, like we have biological temperaments that we are all born with. And so how we kind of come into this world, either being somebody who's a little bit more careful and doesn't want to make mistakes, or somebody who's a little bit more impulsive and ready for an adventure, all of those things, personality traits or temperament, start to interact with the rest of our world. And we have emotions then that develop about ourselves, how we see ourselves, how we see other people, how we see ourselves in relation to others. And on this end of the spectrum of the life experiences that happen, there is also trauma, and the emotions that we experience related to that trauma, the emotions that we have then that start to impact how we see ourselves, how we see other people, obviously, and ourselves in relation to others. So all of that to say, we have to understand that the eating disorder for somebody who has trauma has really become probably for a lot of people kind of the glue that holds those, or it feels like the glue that holds those emotions together, right? And so when we are treating somebody who has an eating disorder and trauma, we really have to recognize how intertwined those are. And if you can't really just go straight for the trauma, and work on the trauma without a sort of a recognition that this eating disorder has been fundamental in helping them kind of keep it all together, or it feels that way. And likewise, if you're treating somebody with an eating disorder and you don't recognize the impact of trauma, you fail to recognize how that trauma not only impacts like past memories and that sort of thing, but every interaction that they have every day moving forward, right? Because there's been an impact on how they see the world and themselves in relation to the world. So so I think the intersection is really about, understanding that function of the eating disorder, in managing those emotions, and really having a deep appreciation for that is essential, because otherwise you're just going to do superficial stuff, which I will say, because I've been in the field for many years, we did a lot of the superficial stuff in treating eating disorders for many years until we realized that the reason that eating disorders persisted and there was such a high relapse rate is because we weren't getting at more of those underlying issues. And so I feel very strongly that you really have to get at those underlying issues if you're going to really help support somebody in sustained recovery.
Gosh, yes. Yes. And I have like 5 different questions based on what you just shared. I feel like with every guest, to the listeners on this show, that's what I say. We just have had such amazing guests. And I'm like, okay, I want to ask you 20 different questions right now. But yeah, I mean, I think you're just so right on here, right? Like, number one, we can't control, or we don't have a say in who our family of origin is or our genetic makeup. So that is a piece that is really important to understand. And I don't know if I've mentioned this on the show yet, but you know this about me, Laurie. I am a sensitive individual, and I used to have quite a bit of shame about that and tried to mask that in various ways. But the more I started understanding, like, okay, I do feel emotion on a deeper level, maybe than the average person. And that doesn't have to be this terrible, big, bad thing, but I can learn to process my emotions appropriately. So, number one, that biological temperament that Laurie's talking about is really important just to be aware of, because I would say that most folks with an eating disorder, and I hesitate to generalize, but this has at least been my experience, and I'm curious to hear about your experience, but I would say most folks do have a little bit more of that sensitive temperament that, in combination with traits like perfectionism or harm avoidance or perhaps some impulse control concerns, can be really what we call the perfect storm in the therapeutic space. So that is really important to understand. And then number two, the environment that you grow up in. So if you go through a trauma and you are in a home in which emotions are not talked about or are not accepted, or perhaps your caregivers are not modeling ways to work through an emotion appropriately, that can really be damaging in the sense of the development of the eating disorder post trauma.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that can make a lot of sense in terms of why individuals go on to develop an eating disorder if we're seeing the function through this lens of emotional avoidance. And no family of origin is perfect, right? But there are some families that are more accepting, more validating of emotion versus that dismissing, minimizing, trying to fix the emotion, what have you.
Yeah, it's you bring up such a good point that partly partly as clinicians we have to recognize that with our clients they come into this world with these biological temperaments, and biological means that is deep in their genes, right? We're not going to therapy that out of them, and we don't want to, right? We
Sure.
want to be able to help them move toward recovery while still maintaining all of those wonderful unique qualities that made them, that are never going to change anyway, right? So if I have a client who's super, who's a highly sensitive person, right? We want to be able to guide that person toward more of an effective way to manage the emotions that do come up, knowing that they are going to be a little bit more sensitive and those are going to be more triggered, and that's never going to change, but we can still help them to learn how to regulate. So we don't want to try to change that biology. The other, which can be a challenge, right? Because you
Sure.
can't
Sure.
really take a cookie cutter approach to treating anybody who has an eating disorder, because you have to take into consideration that. The other part of that is that we all have. I had a dear friend once, and her term was always the story I tell myself, right? And so the story that we have, or the things that happen to us in our world, sometimes we can't change those things,
Sure.
but we also sort of have to recognize that the story that we tell ourselves is about the story that comes in, right? The things that happen to us, but then also what we're telling ourselves about what that means about who we are, what that means about what's okay, right? And what that means, especially with somebody with trauma, right? What do I have to do? What was my role in it a lot of times, how do I have to protect myself in the future? What does this mean about me? And so we really have to sort of recognize that story they tell themselves about the trauma and how they can express the trauma is pretty deep and pretty entrenched, right? Especially if there's complex trauma. If it's an
Absolutely.
individual traumatic event, sometimes that's not to discount that in any way, but sometimes that is a later in life or once in life sort of thing that might have less of a periphery of all the other messages that came in at that time. But certainly somebody with complex trauma, where we want to recognize that there are certain rules about what's allowable and what's not, and how they see themselves, and really realistically what we're going to change is part of their biology.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And when Laurie's talking about all these kind of different ways that we can experience trauma. So really, if you haven't heard that word, which I do feel like it is becoming more mainstream and more people are talking about what trauma is and what it isn't now, which is a wonderful piece, but it's really anything that pushes us outside of our nervous system's ability to cope. And so if you think about the window of tolerance, if you haven't heard of that concept, I highly recommend you look it up. Dan Siegel coined that term. I believe it was in the 90s. But anyway, it's really this fight flight is above the window of tolerance. If you think about two parallel lines, and then fawn or freeze are below the window of tolerance. And it's really anything that pushes us outside of our ability to cope, whether that is more commonly kind of accepted or known are things like a car wreck or an assault. And then we can also have developmental trauma where perhaps we didn't grow up in an emotionally safe home. So there's all sorts of different kind of trauma that Laurie is referencing today.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And you bring up window of tolerance, and I think that sort of leads to a discussion of the physiology of trauma, which is so important in being able to treat trauma, but also somebody who is affected by an eating disorder who also has trauma, right? Because we know that in people who have an eating disorder, their bodies are so deeply impacted in ways that we don't even necessarily think about, right? Because we know that somebody who has an eating disorder, like top level, just right out of the gate, they can tell you, when I engage, regardless of behavioral presentation, when I engage in this behavior, I feel whatever, I feel relief, or I feel a high, or I feel numb, or, they can name some of those things. What we is at a deeper level that we don't necessarily think about with an eating disorder is how their body is feeling in response to feeling more competent, feeling more in control, feeling like, okay, I can manage the storm of emotions, right? And that's when you have an eating disorder without the trauma. When you bring the trauma into that, and our physiology has really stored a lot of the trauma memories, as well as the ongoing need for protection, which happens with almost everybody who has experienced any trauma. They're in this, and if you look at the diagnosis for like PTSD, it's the hypervigilance and hyperarousal,
Sure.
in any number of different experiencing. But we also see the level of dissociation and shutdown with these folks too. So, and that's our body's way of telling us we are outside that window of tolerance, right? We are our nervous system is constantly on overdrive to try to protect us, from future tragedy and trauma, right? And so understanding like how to start regulating our autonomic nervous system is really key. And when you have an eating disorder, unfortunately, the behaviors of the eating disorder are mucking up that system even more, that autonomic nervous system even more. And so having a recognition of how our nervous system and how our physiology is being impacted by both of those brings a lot of awareness for our clients about how they can move forward in trauma resolution, but also eating disorder recovery as well.
Absolutely. And I feel like all of this are, I can think about several conversations that I had when I was under your tutelage, right? Just with you around some of even, I think, the misconceptions that happen both with clients and in the therapeutic space. And, we obviously want to approach this topic with grace and care because I certainly have made mistakes as a clinician, and I'm first to say that. And I can course correct and apologize and learn from those mistakes. But, I want to talk about where we begin, because the reason this question felt important to me is because we see a lot of folks in the practice that perhaps maybe, or we get quite a few inquiries that perhaps maybe want to work on the trauma piece, but not necessarily work on their eating disorder. And so if this is you, I want you to hear from me today. There is no shame in that. And I can understand that. And I can understand why you would want to work on the trauma piece and not necessarily the eating disorder piece. But I would love for you, Laurie, if you feel open to speaking to that a little bit more. And I'm sure that you've had those experiences as well, but kind of this concept or this question of like where we begin when we're seeing both of those together.
Right. Yeah, I like you. I see a lot of folks who come in and want to do that deep trauma work, but don't want to do their eating disorder. And like you, of course, they don't want to treat the eating disorder. I mean, the eating disorder has a very powerful and important function in their lives, right? For a lot of folks, having the eating disorder feels like safety. It feels like protection, right? It feels like certainty about I'm going to be able to kind of hold all this together, right? Who wants to walk away from that? It makes a lot of sense that a lot of people really don't want to deal with the eating disorder. What I try to really help people understand, first of all, is that connection, how they are connected, right? And how, they're creating some space to maybe think about, maybe I wouldn't need my eating disorder as much, if I could work on both of these things. If I could do trauma work without feeling like I'm coming apart at the seams, right? Because the eating disorder is there to kind of pick up the pieces if they start falling apart at the seams. So the first thing I do is try to give them a lot of education about sort of the function of their eating disorder, help them be able to appreciate how their body's physiology is tied together with some of those things. And then we almost always start, and this is true regardless of whether you're working on trauma or eating disorders or both. I very often tell people, chances are, your present is often much less scary than your future tripping or your past tripping or your trauma responses, right? The present moment is often one of the safest places you can be. It doesn't necessarily feel like it all the time because your body's constant searching and scanning and being in protection mode, right, is activating you and telling you that the present is not necessarily safe. But if we can work on present focused awareness, we can really start from a place of safety, right, and then kind of move out. And so I very often really am always going to start with somebody who's impacted with who has an eating disorder, who's impacted by trauma, or trauma, who's really also suffering from an eating disorder. I really start with the present, and then we can kind of move out and create, once we create some safety, and that includes safety in your own body, right? So we can really work on skills to feel more safe in your own body. That's always, as long as you have unresolved trauma, that's always going to be, kind of a constant trigger when you're around other people. But in our therapy room, we can start with some safety. And usually that's where I think the best place to start is.
Yeah, and I completely agree. And when Laurie's talking about present focused awareness, she's really talking about kind of those physical sensations and how that might be connected to an emotional state and perhaps what my thoughts are in those moments, whether they're kind of influenced by my eating disorder self or my healthy self, and then of course any resulting urges that we might have or behaviors that we're engaging in, and that can just really build insight and self-awareness, which I think is just such a fundamental piece of really effective therapy, whether we're treating anxiety, OCD, eating disorders, trauma, that psychoeducation piece. Yeah, I love that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the piece that is important to share with clients around like, hey, we can absolutely do the trauma work. And part of the trauma work is increasing safety, like you said, right? It doesn't necessarily need to be just trauma reprocessing, which is where we would go into a memory and really examine the memory and, try to, grow through the memory and heal from the memory, whatever that might be. But trauma work can also be building safety. And if we are going straight into the trauma memory or memories themselves, then without the skills to live life in the present moment, then that can be quite difficult for clients, especially for clients that are using maladaptive behaviors like eating disorders, because they get a 50-minute session with you or me every week, and then they live their lives outside of therapy. And so that's a really big ask. And so one of the reasons that I learned this from you, Laurie, but is we really want clients to be successful in their treatment. And so that's why we're working on this present focused awareness and skill building and insight first before we're just processing a memory, because we want our clients to be successful in reducing their eating disorder behaviors.
Yeah, I think the older I get, the more I sort of appreciate the role of the role that I have as a clinician in pacing, for our clients, because it is so understandable that when you are so done with feeling, like a victim, or, being so fighting these intrusive, aspects of your trauma, that you want it to be done. You want to be free from that. And you want to dive head first. You've decided you're ready to do it, to do the hard work, and you want to dive head first. And I really feel like it's so important to be able to pace that, because the last thing I want to do is unpack a bunch of stuff. Whether that's, eating disorder or trauma or both, or, unpack that and then send you out there, really raw and feeling even more vulnerable, right, to the rest of the world where you've already felt vulnerable. And so, I really try to talk with clients maybe about why we're pacing things the way they are, and really sort of get some agreement that we want to make sure that you're ready, whatever we unpack, that we're not unpacking it and then just crossing our fingers that you're going to leave and everything's going to be okay. That we're unpacking it because you're ready, because you've developed some internal or external resources to be able to kind of carry that, through the next week.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And one thing that I'm sharing with clients as well is just this piece around nutritional rehabilitation, right? And of course, we're not dietitians, right? But I know that you and I both collaborate quite closely with dietitians in the area. And that why piece is really important as well. Like, I will share with clients that, hey, in my opinion, I think that your trauma processing, so really digging into that memory itself, will be more successful when you are nourished, and when your brain is receiving adequate nutrition and a variety of nutrition, and you're eating consistently. The work that we will do with your trauma and your trauma story will be, in my opinion, more impactful once some of those behaviors are decreased, or once they go down.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's one of the things that's hard for them to believe. I have a lot of
Totally.
folks who are like, well, in fact, it just happened like yesterday. Well, I've been okay this far. I've made it this far. And so I understand why that's really, really hard to believe, that their nutrition might be impacting their ability to process their trauma successfully and to manage the emotions that are coming up. But the truth is, we really do know that anytime you're tired, or you're hungry, or you're sick, or any of those things, that's depleting your internal resources. And if we're going to do trauma work, we really want to bring all the internal and external resources that we can gather to this effort, right? Because then they're just more successful. I mean, that's kind of the bottom line.
Yeah. Yeah. And one thing too that I've seen, and I understand this, but I think some of the newer therapies that have come out maybe aren't as popular, or they're not seen as cool as other therapists. And I am EMDR trained. I went through the certification. I didn't actually get the certification, but I did go through that process. And I think EMDR is a wonderful treatment. And part of the step one of the steps in EMDR is appropriate resourcing, like you're talking about. And so it's kind of some of the tried and true. And I don't think that any therapy is like perfect. I know that you practice from an eclectic lens as well, but more of the CBT, ACT, ERP, those have been around a little bit longer. And so we as humans, I think, oftentimes crave novelty. And I think part of that is wanting the new therapy that's been out there. And I can understand that. EMDR
Mhm.
is really cool and it's a little woo-woo when you actually think about it. But there is something really, I think, beautiful to be said for our ability to separate from our thoughts, or perhaps put less value in our thoughts and name an emotion and the underlying need. And that's such an important piece of the ED recovery work, is being able to do that so that
Mhm.
we can do more of the reprocessing, so to speak, that might be there in EMDR. I don't know if you have any thoughts on
Right.
that.
Well, I do. Because I do EMDR too, but one of the things that I really try to help clients understand is that there is a in being able to reprocess a memory, you need to be able to have safe enough experience in that moment to be able to do proper resourcing, so that you have that safe space. So that's step one. Have you really created enough grounding skills and resourcing and that sort of thing to be able to do this in the first place. But the second place is you have to create you have to have some psychological flexibility, right, to be able to reprocess the memory. And if you don't have that psychological flexibility, either because you're really, really locked into other behaviors, that are managing your emotions, or two, you're not adequately nourished, right? Or three, you're just too low in any of those other internal resources, like we talked about, that reprocessing is not going to be effective, And one of the things, and you've heard me talk about this before, Laura, with regard to, when I make a recommendation for a higher level of care or something like that, part of my job also as a clinician is to not create a situation where you feel more hopeless, right? And sometimes when we do insufficient treatment or inappropriate treatment or under treatment, when we do those things, what we're basically allowing our clients to do is say, yeah, I'm getting treatment for, my trauma, my eating disorder, whatever, but it's not the treatment that's going to help them be well, right? And so they're steadily telling themselves, I'm doing treatment, but they're not getting better. And so that creates a sense of hopelessness. And I really I very much see so much hope, in eating disorder recovery and trauma resolution, and I don't want to create a situation where I have gone along with undertreatment, inappropriate treatment, insufficient treatment, so that it just creates more hopelessness for our clients. And I'm really going to sort of let them know that I stand firm with that, and hopefully we've built enough of a relationship for them to understand when I'm really feeling sort of passionately about that, it's really because I want to engender hope with them, not hopelessness.
Absolutely. And we talk a lot about hope on this podcast. And so I love that we're kind of wrapping with this concept. And I love that you are holding on to that for clients and for people that you're training as well, your supervisees. It's so important, because I know that this work can sometimes be heavy, and what our clients go through. They are incredible survivors. There's incredible resiliency there. And I agree with you. If we've really been in it for days, months, years, it can be quite discouraging. And so it makes sense that our clients come to us and have lost their sense of hope. And so our job, I think, as skilled clinicians, hopefully, is to support them in finding that again and cultivating that within themselves. Yeah, I love that. And I agree with you. There is always hope, no matter how long you have struggled. And maybe this is the first time that you are reaching out for help. No matter how old you are, no matter what your experiences are, there is always hope to really change. And I think that's what we want to perhaps close with today. We will certainly have you back on the show. I know that we have a couple other topics in mind to maybe talk about next time. So I would love to have you back on the show. Thank you so much for everything that you shared today. This has been so fun for me and a great way to start my day. So thanks, Laurie.
Thank you.
Yeah, so y'all know this, but we typically close with some homework for you all. In our practice, we give quite a bit of homework. I know Laurie does as well, but we really want clients to be practicing some of the things that we are talking about in the therapeutic space. And so that's one of the reasons that we give homework on the Becoming Anchored podcast. And we also close with an affirmation. So, Laurie, would you like to give either of those?
Sure. I'll assign the homework, I guess. Your homework is to really push yourself to spend some time each day. And this is according to your window of tolerance. Spend some time each day in mindfulness, recognizing just what your thoughts are. Now, remember that mindfulness is not relaxation, but mindfulness is about just noticing what's going on, noticing what's going on around you, what's going on inside you. There are lots of different metaphors and analogies for that, but basically you're noticing these things without judgment, and you're creating the opportunity for you to, even if your mind drifts off, to another place, whether you're future tripping, past tripping, even if trauma starts to invade that space, right? Trauma responses start to invade that space. Just be mindful of, in a very objective way, of what's happening. Notice it, let it go, and allow whatever's coming back in. If you get distracted, just notice that you're distracted and come back to mindfulness. And in that way, you're starting to practice the ability to notice safety in the present moment and to bring yourself back to safety in the present moment.
I love it so much. I'm going to actually take that with me today and try to do a mindfulness exercise. Yeah. And then just an affirmation. So I think kindness throughout this process feels important today, but maybe something that you take with you is just this idea that I'm capable of extending kindness to myself through my eating disorder recovery and trauma recovery. Thanks for being here, Laurie. In the show notes, you guys can find information about how to find her. And Laurie, is there anything else that you want to share about your practice or ways that our listeners can find you today?
I think my website will be on the show notes too. I'm just happy to talk to anybody who might be struggling, and other clinicians who might just want to kind of bend an ear for a minute.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for your time. I know your time is so valuable, and we're just so grateful. Okay, see you next time. Bye, guys.